Hi guys, it's great to see you again. It's been a little while since the last video and I do apologize for the large gap. It's been one of those busy periods of being stuck into client work, but I'm very excited to share a few stills from those soon. Today I'm going to be reviewing a brand new third-party tool for DaVinci Resolve, Qazi's Toolkit. But before we get into it, I'd like to make a couple of disclaimers. Firstly, this is not a sponsored video and you're not going to find an affiliate link, so I'm not getting paid in any way for my review. However, I was invited to be one of the beta testers of this tool, and so I haven't paid anything for the kit. But I think you'll see for yourself that my review is completely honest because as much as I love some of the DCTLs in the toolkit, there are a few that I'm not entirely convinced about. But before we get into it, just to give you a quick overview of my setup, I'm working with 3 clips from Sony a7S III and I've done my node-based color management with an IDT at the group pre-clip level, and you can see I've converted Sony S-Log3 into Arilog C3 as this is my preferred timeline color space. I've applied simple exposure and white balance adjustments at the clip level, and in the group post clip, I've applied Ari's technical LUT. With this out of the way, let's start with the first DCTL from the kit, QT LookDNA DCTL. When you load up LookDNA, you may get a bit overwhelmed by the number of sliders you see, but we're going to break them down, and by the end, I think you may agree that having such surgical control is actually really cool. First, I'm going to change the color space primaries to Ari White Gamut 3 and the transfer function to Arilog C3 as this is my timeline color space. So what this tool essentially does is it provides a much more efficient way to tackle split toning instead of having to draw your own custom curve. We've actually already covered 3 ways to create split toning on this channel, and if you haven't already seen this video, you can watch it here. What's even better about this tool though is having the ability to apply 2 film prints, the infamous Kodak 2383 and Fujifilm's 3513 in a scene referred environment. I'm sure that all of you know that you can access these film prints in the Film Looks folder for free within Resolve. However, the disadvantage of these LUTs is that they can only output Rec 709 and they don't work in scene referred workflows. So I think for the images we're working with today, Fujifilm 3513's characteristics may work well, as I'd like to add a green tint in the shadows and some warmth in the highlights. We can toggle show curves, and this is going to show us the exact YRGB curve that is applied by the preset. I personally love this feature because you can now tweak this further and create your own flavor of this print. So you can see that under curves we have access to 5 luminance ranges: blacks, undertones, mids, highlights and whites. And our pivot point is locked off to the middle grey point of the color space we've selected down here. So what this means is that no matter how much I push my contrast, the exposure of my middle grey will remain intact. This is especially important when you're building a show LUT, for example. Let me adjust the parameters until I get the look I'm after. Okay, I think this looks nice and I like how little effort it took us to get here. Let's cover some of the additional sliders we have down here. Undertones lock and highlights lock control the threshold where our blacks end and undertones begin, and the same for whites and highlights. I think it's really handy that you can tweak those. This feature actually reminds me of the level of control we see with the HDR zones. Lume Mix is the equivalent of Luminance Mix we have down here in primaries. Next we have Curves Blend, which allows us to dial back the contrast and split toning we just applied. However, I think that this control can be improved further by allowing us to have separate control over the luminance part of our curve, hence the contrast, and the RGB split of our curve. So that's definitely something I'm hoping we'll see in future versions. We have one more section that allows us to control the exposure, temp, tint, saturation, and hue rotation of our look. But these are meant for look development, not balancing. And I think they're handy because they're color space aware, so their behavior is different if compared to the primaries down here. And for our look, I think I'd like to warm it up a little bit. Lastly, we have a bleach bypass section that essentially does what it says on the tin, but this is not what we are going for with this look, so I'm not going to tweak anything in this section. So overall, my thoughts on Look DNA is that there are a lot of amazing things about it, and there are a few things to be desired. Firstly, I love how much easier and quicker it is to create split toning when compared to the traditional route of creating your own custom curve. Additionally, you have access to 5 luminance ranges, and this sort of control isn't really something that I've seen with other third-party DCTLs. Next, I think it's really awesome to be able to access and tweak Kodak 2383 and Fujifilm 3513 in a scene-referred environment. I think this really differentiates this DCTL from LUT, for example. However, I do hope we're gonna see more presets added in future releases. If I had any suggestions to improve this DCTL, I'd say that it would be really nice to have a button that allows you to export a LUT from it. You can do so currently as long as you have done your grading on your clip level, and then you can right click on your clip and go to generate LUT. However, for ease and a better user experience, I think having a button for this would be so much better. Also, I find that the initial loading time when I applied DCTL is a bit long. However, this could be an isolated issue with Windows 10 because I know that the DCTL was tested primarily for Windows 11. But if you're experiencing lags too, hopefully we're gonna see optimizations with future releases. But overall, this is one of my favorite DCTLs from the kit. I've been using it in client work for weeks now, and I do feel that it has speeded up my workflow. Now let's move on to the next tool, QT Charts DCTL. I think if I had to select only one DCTL from the kit, this would be the one. I think charts are so helpful for a number of reasons. They could be useful for look development, shot matching, and making sure that your grade is broadcast safe, for example. So I'm going to apply QT charts at the beginning of my group post clip note tree. You'll see that it has 2 sections, input and output monitoring. And that is because the first set of charts are designed to be placed before your creative look, but after your exposure and white balancing. And the second set should go after your creative look, right before your ODT. I'll cover them as we continue to build our look, as it really makes sense to see them work in context. Therefore, let's move on to the next DCTL. Skin Juice Mixer DCTL. This DCTL is interesting, and I'm unsure whether the name does it justice because for me it doesn't really relate to skin as much as it does to look development. But let's start tweaking it so you can see what I mean. I'm going to go ahead and apply it, and I'll change the color space to Arilog C3. This tool works based on 3x3 matrix, which is the RGB mixer down here. And to illustrate how you can use it, I'm going to turn on Show Selected Skin Hue, and I'll tweak Selected Skin Hue until I've only selected her skin, but her red lipstick is excluded as I don't want to affect it. Now, if I start tweaking Sat Skin, this is going to have an effect on the orange and teal hues. If I increase its value, we're going to increase the saturation in her skin and the sky, and conversely, negative values do the opposite. The next slider, Exposure Skin, adjusts the luminance relationship between orange and teal hues. And now would be a good time to actually switch on Gradient Chart and Color Chart so that we can understand how it works. When you pull the slider to the left, we're making orange hues darker and teal tones get brighter, and the opposite applies when we push the slider to the right. Hue Shift Skin is quite straightforward. It simply allows you to tweak the hue of your skin tones by making them more magenta or more green. And these 3 sliders are quite interesting because they allow you to make preferential adjustments to the colors in your image without affecting your skin tones. I'd really struggled to explain how each one works, as I feel it's best to play around with them and see whether I can get a pleasing result. I think this is where the charts will help you make sense of the adjustments made, rather than just relying on the image that you're working on. So I think I'm going to park my adjustments here, as I like how the foliage has gotten darker and greener. So overall, if I had to share my opinion about this DCTL, I would say that it can be really helpful for look development. For example, if you have a supervised client session and you need to come up with look options very quickly, this could be really helpful to experiment with a mix of different hue and luminance changes that do not affect your skin tones. However, I think that this tool needs another section added that allows you to protect your lips from any adjustments made, the way that we currently have for skin tones. And this is because, as you can see, her lipstick now looks completely different, and that's not ideal. Now let's jump to the next one. QT Sat Control DCTL. I'll apply DCTL from the Effects tab and let's select QT Sat Control. So I think this DCTL is quite clever for a number of reasons. I think of it as a more sophisticated version of the sat versus sat curve because it allows you to adjust the saturation levels of your image based on 3 levels of saturation: low, mid, and high. But what's really cool is that while the sat versus sat curves work in the YRGB additive color model, you get the option of 3 different color models with this DCTL. There is spherical, cylindrical, and HSV. I think that cylindrical may stand for the HSL color model because HSL and HSV are the most common cylindrical color models. But this is just a guess, so please don't take my word for it. So if we go back to our image, we can see that there are a few highly saturated areas that we need to address. For example, the traffic lights in the background, this orange bin in the second shot, and also the red stop sign. We can confirm that they are oversaturated on the vector scope as well. So we can easily tackle those issues if we tweak high sat. If we do before and after, we can see that the saturation levels are now within the gamut of Rec 709, which is great. But now, if we counter this correction by introducing more saturation into the mid-sat, we can see how we've added more life into the image. However, this is not affecting our highly saturated parts of the image, and so the result looks much cleaner. If we do a before and after now, we can see that the trace on the vector scope has only extended in the middle, while the outer edges of the trace have come closer to the middle of the vector scope. I think doing this sort of balancing act between your low and mid saturated areas versus highly saturated areas creates a much more organic result compared to applying a linear saturation across the board. You can also control the threshold of what is considered mid and high sat, which is great, and you can also toggle on sat versus sat curve overlay, which is particularly handy when you're tweaking your threshold controls up here. And lastly, if we toggle between the different color models, I personally see very little difference between the default spherical and cylindrical model, but there is a significant difference with HSV, which makes the hues darker as expected. Having these options is great because you may be looking for a different result depending on your brief. So if I had to share my thoughts on this DCTL, I think that overall it is a great tool. Personally, I do use it a lot to strike a balance between mid and high sat the way we just did in this grade. Now, whether the investment is worth it is a decision I'm gonna leave up to you. There is a way to recreate a sat versus sat curve in HSV and HSL, which I believe is the cylindrical option within the DCTL. However, I'm not aware of a technique to do the same for spherical. And if you're interested in seeing how you can create your own HSL and HSV sat versus sat curve, let me demonstrate it quickly. I'll disable the DCTL, create a new serial node and change its color space to HSV. I'll turn off channel 1, which stands for hue, and channel 3, which is value. Now, if we adjust the points in our custom curve, it's going to behave as a sat versus sat curve. The low saturated parts of our image live in the bottom area of the curve, and the highly saturated areas would be up here at the top of the curve. If we do the same balancing act we just did with the DCTL by raising the bottom part of the curve, and I'll counter that by bringing down the top of the curve, you can see that the result we get is quite similar when we wipe between the two. So this is in HSV, and you can change it to HSL if you just simply change the color space of the node to HSL. So if your budget is limited, you can get away without having this DCTL because you can recreate the effect for HSV and HSL natively within Resolve. Now let's move on to the next one. QT Color Compressor. Color Compressor was developed with the intention to be used primarily for monochromatic looks, but it actually can be used for complementary looks as well, and that's what we're going to try out. So when I apply it, first I'm going to adjust target hue, which shows selected color overlay switched on. And let's say we want to push even more teal into the background. I'll adjust this slider until I get the hue I'm after. And when I start increasing compression near, the tool will start bringing surrounding hues around so that they get closer to the target hue we've set. And if you max it out, you can see how intense the effect can be. If the change starts to seep into your skin tones, you can clean them up by adjusting the nearby color cutoff slider. I'm going for a less stylized look though, so I'll keep my adjustments subtle. So if I had to share my thoughts on Qt Color Compressor, I would say that it can be a really powerful tool. Personally, I haven't used it that much in my workflow so far, but if you're working on types of projects that do require more stylized looks, for example music videos, then I think this could be an interesting one for you. Now let's proceed to DCTL number 6. Qt Skin Compressor. Okay, so this is one of the DCTLs that I'm not fully convinced about, and I'm going to elaborate on the reasoning shortly. To show you how it works, I'm actually going to use a different clip, which is a close-up, so that the effect is much more visible. I'll apply Qt Skin Compressor right after my primaries, where I've balanced the shot. So what this tool essentially does is it reduces hue variations in skin tones and it brings them all together into a single uniform hue. This is particularly helpful for a number of scenarios. For example, you could have a model whose hands lean more towards magenta, or you could be dealing with badly applied makeup. And the way you can tackle those issues is by using a color compressor. So when we load the DCTL, the first thing you want to do is you want to ensure that you have set up your transform function correctly. And then you want to set the skin hue we're targeting. I'll toggle show selected skin hue and then I'll adjust selected skin hue until I have a clean selection of the skin only without her lips. I'm struggling to do so as the redness in her cheeks are sitting very close to the hue of her lips, so let me try to refine the selection with smoothness left and right. I'll toggle these two charts on as they are very helpful in understanding what we're selecting. Okay, so I'm not having much luck, and this can happen when you're working with qualifiers as well. And the way I'll tackle this is by drawing a power window around her lips to exclude them. So let me do that quickly now. So now that we've pulled the selection on the skin, if we increase the value of compress skin hue and perhaps also adjust skin hue rotation, the adjustment may not seem huge, but if we look at our vector scope, we can see how we've brought the hues together. And if we look at the image, we can see how we've removed the greeny yellow hues we had in the skin before. If we apply Qt charts right after our primaries node and turn on skin chart in full screen, we can see how the DCTL compresses different skin variations into a more uniform hue. So I think that the tool definitely works and it gives you results quite efficiently. However, my concern with this DCTL is that the compressed skin hue doesn't have enough bandwidth for me. And to show you what I mean, let's go over the traditional route of using Resolve's native color compressor. Let me grab a still of this and disable the node. Before I can apply color compressor O effects, I need to feed it a selection of the skin, and so to do that, I'm going to pull a qualifier. I know I struggled to separate the redness in the cheek from the lips before, so I'm going to copy paste the power window we already created. Okay, now that this is set up, let's apply color compressor. I'll use the color picker and select a hue from this area of her face. And now when I start increasing compress hue, we can see how the signal on the vector scope is really getting compressed heavily. I'll also adjust compress saturation slightly. And now when I do a comparison between the previous version with the DCTL and this version, I personally think that the traditional route provides a better result. So overall, I think that Qt Color Compressor can be helpful if you don't have a lot of time to spend and you do need to do some skin compressioning. But for me, it needs to have a lot more bandwidth before I can abandon Resolve's Color Compressor. Now let's check out DCTL number 7. Qt Film Density. So this DCTL does exactly what it says on the tin. It allows you to increase the density on a global level, or you can tackle specific hues. For this look, I'm going to apply Qt Film Density right before Look DNA, and I'll set up the transfer function to Arilog C3. And let's start increasing the density of cyan, as I feel that the sky is too bright. I'll tweak the selection with cyan fall off as well. I'll actually adjust the global density too, and I think this looks okay. If we go back to our input monitoring charts and turn on color chart, we can see how this density change is affecting our hues. So I'm afraid that this is another DCTL from the kit I'm not entirely convinced about. And this is simply because with Resolve 19, we already have color slice built in. And so for me, that completely excludes the need to use any third-party tools for density. So let's do a comparison between the two. I'll grab a still of this, disable the node, create a new node and label it color slice. Let's open it up and tweak the selection of cyan with highlight mode switched on. Now let's start increasing density, and I think this looks good. I'll also tweak the global density so it's a fair comparison. And if we wipe between the two, I personally don't see that much of a difference. So personally, I would stick to Color Slice because I don't see any point in investing in a third-party tool when the same results are just as accessible and efficient within Resolve. Now moving on to the final tool, Qt Halation. I'm going to apply this DCTL right after Look DNA and Output Monitoring Chart and set up its color space and transfer function to Arilog C3. The DCTL provides 4 halation presets, and for this look I think I'm going to go with Super 16. Let me dial back the intensity, I'll adjust the hue to be a bit more yellow, and I'll definitely dial back the saturation. Now, whether this looks like a realistic 16mm halation is definitely not something I can judge. I do feel that halation is something that is completely preferential, and it doesn't necessarily have to reflect how a true halation would look like if this were shot on film. So I personally like how this looks. But I think that what this DCTL lacks is the ability to set a threshold of the luminance range that halation is applied to. And this is something that is available with Resolve's built-in halation O effects, and I feel is much needed in this DCTL. So overall, I think it's intended to be something that you can just apply and not do tons of tweaking on. But personally, I prefer having control over different settings, especially the threshold. Now that we have our look in place, we can use output monitoring charts to evaluate whether there is something we can tweak further. First, I'm going to turn on Skin Hue Indicator and see whether my skin is looking too green or magenta and make any changes if needed. Next, if we turn on Negatives Indicator, according to the website, this visualizes negative cold values, NANs, and infinities. So if I understand this correctly, if I create a new serial node before my chart and drop down my shadow log wheel, as I start to clip the shadows, this chart is going to indicate so in purple. However, I don't quite understand what the rest of the colors mean, so I wish there were documentation for each chart that explains them in more detail. Next up, false color is quite straightforward. It indicates the exposure levels across our image, which can be useful for shot matching. Sat false color is one of my favorite charts though, because this can be super helpful to ensure that your saturation is broadcast safe and within the limitations of Rec 709. I can go back to sat control and dial back the max sat so that the traffic lights in the background are within Rec 709's gamut. And last but not least, we have highlight neutrals, and this indicates areas where the saturation levels are below 5%, and this can be very useful if you're creating a clean white look, for example. So I like to go through these charts once I've completed grading a project as a quality check, because your eyes do start to drift away the longer you grade, so having these charts as an objective judge of my work has been really helpful. Finally, let's evaluate the look we were able to build with Qt. So what do you guys think? Are there any DCTLs that you think may be useful in your work? If you aren't sure whether this is worth the investment, I would highly encourage you to download the demo version and test it out yourself. But hopefully this video has been useful to see how the tools work and perhaps form an opinion on whether Qazi's toolkit is something you may be interested in. As always, thank you for watching. If you found this video to be helpful, please like and consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you in advance, and I'll see you in the next one.